Now, there are concerns over the delays in the parliamentary process to appoint a new Deputy Public Protector. The Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services will have to restart the appointment process after legal advice recommended that EFF MP Busisiwe Mkhwebane recuse herself due to her connections to two candidates interviewed for the position. Now, the former public protector slammed the decision, arguing that despite her links to the candidates, she would remain impartial. For more on the story, I am joined by Professor André Duvenhage, research professor at the Northwest University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us this evening on News at Prime. Now, the two different relationships that are between Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane and the two candidates in question, what are we to make of these concerns that have been raised? I mean, it is clear that the legal advice has been made that she should have actually recused herself. But what should we also make of the fact that she didn't disclose the relationship between herself and these two candidates?
Good evening, Masa, and the listeners. I think the principle, the core principle that is applicable here is the one of the separations of power, where the legislative authority must appoint a person in a legal national prosecution authority capacity. So it's a principle related to oversight. But the problem is that Busisiwe Mkhwebane is a very controversial figure in general and was also the head of the National Alliance as a public protector. And that is making the position very difficult. And in order to make sure that process and protocol are proper and that decisions are according to the rules without conflict of interest, the Parliament obtained the advice not to continue with the existing process, but to start a new process, appointing the new deputy. I believe that Busisiwe Mkhwebane, it will be better to take her out of the process because there are some personal conflict and personal relationship in terms of two of the candidates. And that is making the process, in a way, controversial. So in order to be correct in terms of process, protocol, ethics, and then the advice coming from the legal authority within Parliament, I believe it is the right choice to take her out of the process, to put her in another position and maybe bring someone else in to conduct the interviews and deal with the process of appointment of the Deputy National Prosecution Authority person.
And Prof. André, wouldn't you say that perhaps this advice as well, the legal advice, and perhaps also the objections from the ANC and the Democratic Alliance prior to the process even starting should have been taken more seriously, as opposed to us starting the process and now having to scrap everything that has been started and doing everything from scratch again?
Yes, indeed. I believe they could have dealt with the process earlier and obtained a better result. But you know how politics are going. There are always objections, and it's about this and about that, and politicians are fighting for their own priorities and what they would like to achieve, and not always following the correct legal processes. But clearly, this was a mistake, but at least we can say the mistake is rectified, and now we are back in terms of the core principle of parliamentary oversight over important appointments in the executive, but also within the legal framework.
What do you make of Busisiwe Mkhwebane's argument, because she has rejected this legal advice as well, and she says, look, I am able to be impartial, but also she says it's not going to be my sole decision anyway. Ultimately, it will be decided by the committee. What do you make of that argument?
Well, in a way, there is merit in the argument, because we must take into consideration that she is in that committee as a representative of the EFF. In that sense, she has the mandate of a party, and the party has a certain support base, and the leadership is supposed to represent that specific support base. In that sense, she has a point to make. But when it comes to the personal conflict and the conflict of interest, this is making the decision controversial. And if you have maybe one person that can influence the process negatively, you are getting a process that is not accepted, a process without legitimacy. And we know at the moment that the National Prosecution Authority is facing major challenges in terms of effectiveness, efficiency, in terms of their independence, etc. So at this point in time, we cannot afford a controversial appointment. That is in the interest of the rule of law as well as the independence of the whole judiciary and the National Prosecution Authority.
And with regard to that argument as well, it was ANC MP Ngola who said that it's irrelevant that Mkhwebane is not the sole determinant of the process. What is the impact of all of this back and forth on the business of the Public Protector's Office?
Well, I think the Public Protector's Office is already in a position where society at large and institutions are seeing it in a very negative light. So it's not an institution that is above critique. It's an institution that people are seeing not as independent and is seen as biased in some way. In that sense, these appointments are extremely critical, especially 2 months before probably the most difficult election since 1994. So I think at this point in time, the government as well as the system at large cannot afford another controversial appointment. We have just listened to the whole controversy with regard to the Speaker, and this is already reflecting negatively not only on the ANC but also on government institutions at large and on the tendency of corruption. And we know the history of Busisiwe Mkhwebane and her alignment with certain political forces. So the correct appointment and independent appointment and appointment that is above board is critical under these circumstances.
And just speaking of how vital that is as well, you mentioned the separation of power, and that should be pretty clear and straightforward. Talk to us about the need for this kind of objectivity in such critical appointments.
Well, Amasa, we are in a critical stage in the consolidation of our democracy. And when we talk about democracy, we are talking about principles like limited government, constitutional government, the concept of constitutionalism, rule of law, and the very important one, the separation of powers. Now, the whole idea of the separation of powers are linked to the concept of limited government, where you are arguing that no single individual or institution can control all the powers of the state. Therefore, the powers are differentiated among the legal branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. And these branches are checking each other in terms of an oversight function, a system which we like to call checks and balances. And these are critical for the consolidation of our democracy. And if we look at our recent history, and if we look specifically at the tendency of state capture, it was a clear undermining of constitutional principles and also implicating that the separation of power principle are not applied in the proper way. At this point in time, we need to restore our democratic principles, and we need to make the right appointments. We have the debate between the DA and the ANC and government in a way between the whole cadre deployment thing, which is very controversial. So we need to step away from that. My take on it is that the whole concept of cadre deployment is not aligned with sound democratic principles and principles you can relate to a democratic dispensation. And this is making these appointments so crucial, that they are independent, that they are above board, and that they are according to proper process and protocol.
You know, you earlier made mention of this crucial year, an election year as well, a very important election that is as well in our democracy. These kinds of appointments, these kinds of controversies regarding these appointments, a few months before the elections, I mean, what message does that send to South Africans?
Well, I think South Africans at this point is very sensitive about what is going on in the political environment. They are very sensitive about corruption. We have seen what corruption can do to systems. We can also argue that the formation of the MK party, to a large extent, is a product of action taken against corrupt individuals in terms of the Zondo Commission. And I believe that this time, ordinary citizens are going to be a lot more tough on issues like corruption, but also other issues like service delivery, the integrity of government, leadership issues, ethical governance, and so on. So I think that we are going to see a more critical approach coming from the ordinary citizens, and this is going to reflect in the outcome of the 2024 elections. And my take on it at this point is that we are looking at a reconfiguration of the political spectrum, most probably the biggest change since 1994. And this will have implications on a national level to a certain extent, but definitely within provinces like Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, maybe even a province like the Western Cape.
Prof. Duvenhage, thank you so much for your time and your insights, always hearing your contributions on News at Prime.